Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inloco MetaTalks. My name is Elza, also known as Inloco Sharky. I am the curator of Inloco Gallery and your host for today. A huge thank you for being with us today, whether in spatial, YouTube, or LinkedIn stream, and for joining this journey for over a year now. It's been an incredible ride exploring the edges of art, technology, and immersive storytelling with all of you. So, by the way, today we are joined by Anastasia, Ananest, former producer and key early contributor at Inloco Gallery. What a better way to close this year's chapter than with a truly special guest, someone who has been documenting the soul of this industry long before most of us even put on a headset. Please join me in welcoming Kent Bai, experiential journalist, XR oral historian, and the voice behind one of the most important archives in immersive tech, the Voices of VR podcast. For nearly a decade, Kent has conducted over 1,800 deep dive interviews with pioneers, artists, and philosophers of virtual and augmented reality. He doesn't just report on trends, he maps the ecosystem of meaning behind them. By the way, some of you might remember Ryan Hartzell, an incredible immersive media artist and cinematographer who joined us earlier this year. Well, Ryan was also a guest on Ken's podcast. It's a perfect example of how his podcast maps the ecosystem we are all part of. Today, we are here to talk about the beginning of a new immersive circle. We've lived through waves of VR hype and hardware, but now with new open platforms like AndroidXR and SteamOS on Horizon and AI reshaping creation itself, where are we really heading? Kent, you have a front row seat to the evolution of this entire industry, and we are ready to see it through your lens. We are all plugged in. The stage is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elsa. Thanks for inviting me here to this very unique setting, location here in spatial.io in your vertical horizon 361 degrees gallery here. I'm excited to talk around what I see as sort of the beginnings of a new immersive cycle. And I feel like a lot of people can feel this in their gut that we're about to start into like a new chapter. And I want to formalize that a little bit just in terms of the way that I look at it through these different cycles of of history, but also looking forward to see, there's this big question of like when XR is going to go mainstream. So I am, oops, hold on. Let me, is that okay? All right. So I'm Kent Bai and I do the Voices of VR podcast. And so since 2014, I've been going to lots of different events around the industry and recording lots of different things in terms of what's happening in the mainstream of the technology, but also looking at immersive storytelling and trying to, capture an oral history of this medium as it's unfolding to tell the deeper story of what's happening with XR. And I'll be unpacking this graphic here later on, but I need to first kind of set up some context and details to see where we've been and where we're going. And so I'll be sort of aiming towards this near the end of the talk, but I wanted to give a little bit more context as to these different cycles. Okay, so first, before we do that, I want to talk around the difference between tech diffusion and tech evolution. So I'm sure we've all seen this crossing the chasm into the mainstream graphic where you have the innovators and early adopters, and then at some point you cross the chasm and you reach into the mainstream, and then you have the late majority and the laggards. And so you can start to map this out in terms of like market share percentage and start to see how as you go along toward the early majority, you hit around like the halfway mark, and then you start to go viral, and then eventually you achieve mass ubiquity. And so there's this kind of diffusion theory in the S curve with that's trying to map out this early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. We're still in the early adopter, early majority phase. We haven't, I don't think we're nowhere near that halfway mark of kind of tipping over and then going into the late majority and laggards in terms of XR specifically, virtual and augmented reality. And Simon Wardley has this model of technology evolution, which is different than diffusion, as like diffusing out into the world. He sees that the product is kind of going through these distinct phases of evolution where there's a genesis, that's like the academic idea where you're proving out a concept. You have then into the custom built, moving in that product into the enterprise space where it's handcrafted, it's bespoke, you're doing it new every time, and eventually you get into a mass consumer product that is, ready for everybody, and then eventually it becomes a mass, like a commodity and mass ubiquity. And so we could see like the smartphones have kind of reached that commodity phase, although there's still some distinct differences between iOS and Android. And so we're still kind of in that product phase where it hasn't been like, when you go to the gas, and fill up your car with gasoline, it doesn't really matter what kind of gas you use most of the time. And so we're not necessarily at the stage of commodity even for smartphones. But at some point, this is kind of the trajectory from going from academic idea, what's happening in enterprise, then the mass consumer, and then into mass ubiquity. So what this graphic tells me is that you can start to go to what's happening in, say, enterprise spaces at things like Augmented World Expo or location-based entertainment or with immersive storytelling to get like a little bit of a sneak peek into the future as to where the technology is going to be going before it hits those mainstream pockets. So in this evolutionary model, you have the prototype in Genesis, the custom built enterprise app, consumer product, and then it gets into mass ubiquity, or it's a commodity. And so if we look at virtual and augmented reality, you have the initial prototype of the Sword of Damocles, which happened in 1968. Then you have the custom bespoke apps of VPL Research from 1985 to 92, this very early phase of enterprise XR. And then you have consumer VR from 2013, 2019. These are the headsets. And of course, we're still in that consumer phase. We're not in that mass ubiquity phase, but this is just like a sampling of the different headsets that are out there. And at some point, we're aspiring that the XR is going to reach this phase of ubiquitous commodity, maybe by 2033 or maybe by 2042. And I'll unpack why I say those two dates here later. So technology evolves iteratively. So you can see that there's the different strands between PC VR and mobile VR, and eventually you get to the Oculus Quest 2. And so you see that each iteration has a new wave of diffusion. So each, like the Oculus DK1 had probably 30,000 people or so. I don't know the exact number, but that's the 100% adoption rate. And then the DK2, has a little bit more. And then, the CV1 and then the different versions of the Rift, each one subsequently are getting larger and larger, diffuse out into the world. So the technology is evolving, but it's also diffusing. And you can see like a century of technology diffusion since like 1900, 2005, where you have like electricity coming in, the telephone, refrigerator. You have like these historical kind of artifacts to see like, okay, over the past century plus, we see how different technologies have taken time where they're first introduced and eventually they cross over the halfway point and then kind of eventually they're mass ubiquitous where pretty much everyone has access to these. And there's another diffusion curve where this one is actually like including some more details, like black and white television is included in this one where it wasn't before. And this is from like 1920 to 1999. But the main point is that you can start to see how there's a historical precedent over the last century for technology diffusing. And sometimes it gets out to mass ubiquity, and not every technology is destined to be, used by the masses. So there's this quote by Kierkegaard that I really like, which is, "It is really true what philosophy tells us, that life must be understood backwards. But with this, one forgets the second proposition, that it must be lived forwards." So this is just the insight that's very easy to like be right now and look backwards and to see the patterns, but it's also very difficult to like be here now and to like project those patterns out into the future. And so that's kind of like the goal of any futurist, is to look at the past and then kind of project out into the future. And that's a little bit of like, this presentation I'm sort of developing, and haven't really presented on this very much. I just presented on it for the very first time at United XR, but it was only like 5 minutes. So this is kind of the first time that I've had an opportunity to kind of develop some of this, strategy and approach of how I start to look at the larger industry. Okay, so when will XR reach ubiquitous commodity? By 2033 or 2042? And I'll unpack why I say those, kind of two rough timeframes. But before I do that, I need to explain a little bit for what is time. So Aristotle would describe time as the number of change with respect to the before and after. So when you look at two moving objects, you're able to basically determine, time as it's passing. So as an example, you can look at the diurnal rotation of the Earth relative to the sun, and you can see, as that's rotating around, that you essentially have the course of a day that's unfolding. and if you have the rotation or relation of the moon to the earth. So over the course of 1 month of the lunation cycle, you have the moon that's going around the earth, but you see all the different shadows. So here we have the new moon phase that sort of begins a lunation cycle, and then you have around the first quarter phase right here, and then eventually the full moon where it comes into full bloom, and then it starts to wane, and then get to third quarter square, and then back into the new moon. So this kind of gives you a spatial representation of roughly around a month or so. And then you can look at the relation of the Earth to the Sun, which is 1 year. So it takes 1 year for the Earth to go around the Sun. So you can look at different planetary bodies to get some semblance of time. And that's essentially how we use our methods of measuring time. You can also look at the Earth and Venus relationship. So you can have every 8 years, so every time the Earth goes around the Sun 8 times, you'll have 13 Venus solar orbits, but also relative to that, you'll have 5 synodic periods for Venus and the Earth. So you have this kind of ratio between 8 Earth orbits with 5 Venus orbits and 5 synodic periods. And this is basically, this shape gives a sense of like an 8 year period. So it's another way of looking at larger swaths of time. And in the quadrivium, they have lots of other different spatial representations of time, of lots of other different cycles and planetary periods. And so I'm saying now we're at the beginning of a new planetary period, a new beginning, the beginning of a new cycle, and explain a little bit about what I mean by that exactly. So, I'll be digging into this graphic here that's going to be digging into the specific cycle that we're in right now. But I think we're, anytime we talk about cycles, we're like cycles within cycles within cycles. So there's lots of larger context for the cycle that went. So I want to take a step back and look at this book by Richard Tarnas named Cosmos and Psyche, Imitations of a New Worldview, where he starts to look at these larger cycles of planetary periods and start to describe the different archetypal character of those. And so of those, he's looking at like the 500-year period of Neptune Pluto, the 111, 143 of Uranus Pluto, 170 years of Uranus Neptune. And these larger cycles, he starts to, map out. So if we just look for it as an example of Uranus Neptune, we can start to see that this is from like 1880 to 2397. And we can start to map on top of that how this is really kind of like at the turn of the century where we have electricity, we have film as a medium, we have television, refrigerator, we have basically, over the past, since like 1900, we've had a complete revolution of all the different mass media communication technologies that are available. And so that kind of maps over to this conjunction between Neptune and Pluto that's kind of marks a new epoch. That's a 500-year cycle. And if you look at the previous one that started from like 1387 to 1904, then you can look at other planetary cycles like Uranus Pluto. So you can look at the first conjunction between Uranus and Pluto is basically the printing press. So of the previous era of 500 years, we have the printing press that kind of marked the mass communication modality of that era. And if you look at like Alex McDowell's Brief History of Storytelling, you'll see, the printing press is a big turning point in the history of media, where things tended to be more kind of tribal or shared. There would be oral histories. People would share it. It would be dynamic. It would change. When people tell myths, they would tell it, and it'd be different every time. But once it got the printing press came along, then it got a little bit more canonicalized and like linear. And it sort of started a new era, and it catalyzed the Reformation and the scientific revolution. It brought up a lot of different things, but one thing it did with storytelling was made it very linear up until we get to kind of this modern era where we have computing technologies that allow us to be a little bit more immersive and interactive. So this kind of post-linear world of storytelling is kind of a throwback to like ancient times when people used to tell stories around the campfire, and it would be very collaborative and participatory. So here's what Rick Tarnas and Cosmos Psyche has to say about the printing press. He says, even going back as far as the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of 1450s, development of the Gutenberg press, we see another version of this theme, the unprecedented unleashing of both historical forces and the creative forces of the human spirit that took place in the wake of the printing press, which proved to be a crucial precondition for many of the most important cultural and technological developments of the modern era. And for Tarnas, he is looking at these relationships of these outer planets, and he's able to say, okay, when they're this close to each other, then it marks out a specific period of time. So like 1450 to 1461, when it's exact as 1455 to 1456. That's when the Gutenberg Bible was published, and that was kind of like marked when the printing press kind of went viral, as it were. And this is connected to the 1960s. So, like 1960 to 72 is another era where we have this kind of revolutionary spirit, um, where we can compare, this 500-year period with the printing press and look at the similarly. That's when the mother of all demos was made with Doug Engelbart, where he basically demonstrated all the different things of modern computing technology. He demonstrated the mouse for the first time. He just demonstrated like video conferencing, and he even had like a corded keyboard and GUI interface for computer Windows. Basically, he defined the trajectory and a roadmap for where computing would go for the next 50 to 70 years in this one demo that he did in 1968. So when I look at this kind of 500-year period of the previous period being defined by the printing press, I see that this next era is sort of defined by computing technologies. So both computing that is going to be XR technologies, but all computing that we have on our mobile phones, but also artificial intelligence as a part of this complex as well. As we move forward, the printing press of our era are computers, essentially. And so I just wanted to read this comment from Tarnas because he's talking around the planetary cycles corresponding to these kind of archetypal cultural cycles. He said, I was encouraged to examine the possible existence of historical correlations with planetary cycles when I encountered a number of highly suggestive patterns in which certain cyclical alignments between outer planets coincided with major historical events and cultural trends of distinctive character, as if the specific archetypes associated with those planets were emerging in the collective level in periodic cycles. One of the first such instances was the decade of the 60s. By all account, the 60s were an extraordinary era, intense, problematic, and seminal. The entire decade seems to have been animated by a particularly vivid and compelling spirit, something, quote, in the air, an elemental force apparent to all at the time that was not present in such a tangible matter during the immediate preceding or subsequent decades. In retrospect, still sets the era apart as a phenomena unique in recent memory. Early in the course of my research, I noticed that during that entire period of this decade, specifically from 1960 to 72, there took place a conjunction of two outer planets of Uranus and Pluto that occurs relatively rarely. Indeed, this was only conjunction of these planets in the entire 20th century. So in other words, in the 60s, we all, have heard, I wasn't there, I wasn't alive, but we've all heard of the kind of cultural zeitgeist that was the 60s, that was a distinct kind of cultural counter revolution, lots of liberation movements, but also marked like the beginning of virtual reality, kind of despite all the odds in 1968, the Sword of Damocles with Ivan Sutherland. He, that basically the same conference that the Mother of All Demos was presented, he presented some of the first papers of virtual and augmented reality. So this was kind of marks the first wave. The genesis of VR was kind of born in this kind of time period. And Tarnas, he is making this distinction between archetypal prediction and concrete prediction. He says he gradually came to recognize that contrary to traditional reputation and deployment, such an astrology is not concretely predictive, but rather archetypally predictive. The essential structure of this emerging astrological paradigm appeared to be focused not on the prediction of specific concrete outcomes, but rather the precise discernment of archetypal dynamics and their complex unfolding in time. In other words, you can't make concrete predictions. You don't know what is going to happen specifically when. You can just say, archetypally, I know this energy is going to be there, but I don't know specifically what is going to happen. And just to kind of flesh out what he was saying around this cycle, just to get a sense of like, this is the emergence of the new printing press of our era is kind of being, defined and shown during this time period. He says, for Uranus Pluto, that the archetypal complex seemed to express itself quite dramatically through those specific historical areas in which Uranus and Pluto were in axial alignment. So, in other words, conjunctions, square, opposition, but in this case, the conjunction, as evidenced by such phenomena such as widespread radical social political change, often destructive, upheaval, massive empowerment of revolutionary and rebellious impulses, intensified artistic and intellectual creativity. Other distinctive themes of these historical periods include unusual rapid technological advance, an underlying spirit of restless experiment, drive for innovation, urge for freedom in many realms, revolt against oppression, embrace of radical political philosophies, and intensified collective will to bring forth a new world. These impulses and events were typically mixed with massive demographic shifts and a general ambiance of fervent, often violent intensity combined with excitement and movement rapidly towards new horizons. He also talks around later in Cosmos and Psyche how these kind of political movements have been correlated to like scientific and technological advances. And so I wrote an article in 2017 where I was basically looking at the history of VR and trying to map it into like these waves of VR with these archetypal cycles, and made a few predictions that I made back in 2017 that I'll share what I said back then and why I say now is kind of the beginning of a new cycle. So the three waves of VR kind of roughly correlate to like these time periods where there's these major outer planet transits where the first wave of VR was from like the 60s with Ivan Sutherland, which was correlated to the Uranus conjunct Pluto. The second wave of VR was with Uranus conjunct Neptune. That was when the World Wide Web really took off. And it was also this kind of like entrance into a new era for computing. And so that was the enterprise phase. And then, consumer phase was from 2007 to 2020. And, around 2012, 2013, 2014, when I started to hear around Oculus around 2013, I guess it was, after it had been released, I sort of identified it as like, wow, this seems to be like a technology that is reflecting what Tarnas was talking about in his book. And there's a big part of how I took what he was saying around this time period, be like, hey, I see this happening in front of me. I could sort of feel that revolutionary spirit. And for anybody that kind of lived through the early days of XR, you kind of understand that it was like this, unique pregnant moment that sort of took us back to what it might have felt like if anyone who lived through the 60s might have felt like. So there's lots of these different, kind of transits and different cycles. And so, when I look at VR, it's sort of connected to three major ones, which is the bottom here, the most, the longest, well, there's the larger one, which is the Neptune Pluto, but that's not listed here. But this is Uranus Neptune, Uranus Pluto, as well as the Saturn Neptune. Before I dive into the Saturn Neptune and all those other things, I just wanted to briefly go through a little bit of what he said around Saturn Pluto, because basically anybody who experienced the pandemic was sort of speaking to this unique time that was Saturn Pluto. So for Tynes, and in his book, he's marking how the Saturn Pluto time periods were basically marked by World War One, the Great Depression, World War Two. There was the Vietnam War, and different attacks that were happening. 9/11 was a Saturn Pluto opposition. And so this was presented by Chad Harris at a consciousness conference. And this was before the pandemic happened. And so he didn't quite know exactly what else was going to happen. But you can see the dates for the 1 degree orb was from December 2019 to January 2020. That was when we started to hear around I was at Sundance and heard about the virus and the coronavirus. And then basically, from the larger orb from January 2018 to 2021, you have what we all experienced as the sort of pandemic. And so I'm just going to read what Tarnas wrote back in 2007, just to give you a sense of like, this was his archetypal prediction. And you can kind of just in your gut sort of match up what you felt through what he was describing in the past through what you might have experienced during the pandemic. A vivid complex of qualities, emotions, and meanings connected with those grave events, the beginning of two world wars, September 11th and its aftermath, and other such events during the periods of Saturn Pluto. Alignments fit with remarkable precision the synthesis of archetypal principles associated with those two planets in combination, expressed in their most extreme form, both negatively and positively. So, profoundly weighty events of enduring consequence, violence and death on a massive scale, the irrevocable termination of an established order of existence, the collective intensification of division, antagonism, and hostility, the deployment of massive, highly disciplined, carefully organized destructive power, and a widespread sense of victimization and suffering under the impact of cataclysmic and oppressive forces of history. So, for me, the sort of the irrevocable termination of established order, and also the profoundly weighted events. I didn't know what was going to happen during that, but that seemed to match closely for what my experience was. We all kind of understand that the pandemic was a turning point, and so in this sort of context, it sort of matches archetypally with these previous moments in time. But also, there's like the pandemic and that the 2020 sort of marked the beginning of a new cycle. And the other thing that happened during the pandemic was that the billionaires got even more rich. I mean, they got, there's a consolidation of wealth and power with a lot of businesses that went out of business. That sort of Saturn Pluto consolidation of wealth and power, which is sort of speaking to the Saturn Pluto complex, was amplified. And so even there's a lot of things that happen, but if there's one thing that is sort of we're going to be living with for a long time is the influence of these super rich billionaires, where their power and wealth was even more consolidated because of all these sort of smaller businesses that went out of business. Also, just worth noting that the Dartmouth AI was out of the Cold War. And so you can see the founding of the Cold War happened after the end of the war. And that was sort of the beginning of a new cycle. And the first quarter score after that was us thinking about how we're going to use computing technologies to fight this Cold War. And that's how AI was born, was in the context of fighting these wars in a military context. And so there's a sort of a Saturn Pluto connection to artificial intelligence where there's a lot of questions around how is this consolidating wealth and power, who is whose wealth is being consolidated and whose power is being consolidated. In what context is AI being used to fight these geopolitical wars and battles? As we think around AI and China and all these other discussions, then it ends up being a much more, geopolitical force of collective impact of what the impact of AI is going to be in the context of warfare and geopolitics. So I think it's worth kind of seeing that this Saturn Pluto is distinctly different than the Saturn Neptune, which I'd say is more VR, which is talking about these larger issues. So again, this is kind of like a visualization of these, and that hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of just a concrete example of some of Tarnas's work. And philosophically, Tarnas had to write a whole book called The Passion of the Western Mind, where he was trying to reestablish idealism and Plato and sort of Platonic idealism and Neoplatonism as a philosophical foundation for these ideas. And also process philosophy is another kind of metaphysical foundation that sort of describes these kind of new worldviews of these archetypal approaches. Okay, now I'm going to start to dive into more back into the VR. So we have the 3 waves of VR being connected to these waves. I want to just say something around Neptune because VR is very connected to Neptune as an archetype. It's considered to govern the transcendent dimensions of life, the imaginative and spiritual vision, the realm of the ideal. It rules the invisible and intangible ground of experience, shaping awareness beyond the usual causal mechanisms. Its characteristic influence is one of dissolving boundaries and structures, merging that which was separate. It favors the unitive over the divided, the timeless over the temporal, the immaterial over the material, the infinite over the finite. The Neptune archetype is also associated with delusion, illusion and delusion, deception and self-deception, confusion, ambiguity, projection, Maya. It rules both the positive and negative meanings of enchantment, both poetic vision and wishful fantasy, mysticism and madness, higher realities and delusional unreality, and informs all that is paradoxically united. It transcends and confuses, attempts to maintain strict boundaries, definitions, and dichotomies. It is the archetypal principle of the multidimensional and the multi-empirical and metaphorical and multivalent. So basically, VR is sort of dissolving the boundaries of what's real, what's not real, allows you to have this kind of ideal experience of reality. But there's this kind of blending and blurring of the digital and the physical that we're going to be moving into, and this kind of fusion between our virtual online lives and our physical lives are going to continue to be merged together into one seamless kind of amalgamation as we move forward. But this kind of the Neptune archetype speaks to like the larger dynamics of virtual reality. I'm going to skip over the Uranus Neptune just in consideration of time, just because I do want to get into the kind of the cycles of basically in this. Tarnas is talking around the World Wide Web. I'll just read this one where he's talking about equally suggestive of this archetypal gestalt is the terms and metaphors of cyberspace, the World Wide Web, surfing the data stream, hypertext, dynamic and nonlinear amorphous sea of virtually infinite sources of information, complexly interconnected through hypertext links, all mediated through genie-like search engines that have revolutionized the search for and transmission of knowledge. So it's, Tarnas has some really beautifully poetic descriptions around that, but that the kind of the birth of the World Wide Web and the internet sort of speaks to this Uranus Neptune, which is kind of marks the second wave of VR that I talk about in my article. And then basically VR is kind of hitting all 3 of these major outer planet cycles, and you can look at them as they're spaced out. And there's other ones that are in there as well. And the Saturn Pluto, we talked around a little bit. The Saturn Uranus, once we come into like 2030, we'll have a better sense. But Meta rebranded themselves under like a Saturn Uranus. They changed from it's a third quarter square that they did that. So they changed from Facebook to Meta. So there could be things where like the metaverse is sort of dying out right now, although it's still certainly going to be a thing that is reinvigorated at some point. It just may not be like in the mainstream right now, but here we are sort of in the proto metaverse listening to me talk here. So Clearly, it's going to continue to persist, but it may not be until like the 2030s where there's a new cycle of interest of where we've gone with the Minecraft and Fortnite and other aspects of people gaining, having these experiences mediated through technology on online spaces. Uh, but if you look at kind of the history of all these different technologies, there's lots of different things that are coming up that are influencing where virtual and augmented reality are. You see this century of technology diffusion. We have all these different strands of all these technologies coming together, and you basically after books, you have film, radio, television, video games, internet, mobile phone, VR, and AR. All of that is within roughly the last 100 plus years of this technology diffusion. After electricity comes up with this kind of new 500-year cycle, we have all of these other new mass media technologies coming together, and they each have their kind of experiential and phenomenological modes of presence that, active presence, mental social presence, embodied environmental presence, emotional presence. They each have their own center of gravity, but they're also being informed by each other as we, move forward. And so I did want to talk around, this Saturn Neptune, and I talked a little bit about Neptune, but in my article around the archetypal cycles of virtual reality that I published back in 2017, I made this prediction where it says it's very difficult to predict when VR is going to achieve this phase of mass ubiquity. I suspect that immersive and ambient computing technologies will reach a level of maturity, mass ubiquity, either in 8 more years, coincident with the first exact alignments of Saturn Neptune and Uranus Pluto trine of summer 2025. We're basically in that now, and through 2026, or another 28 years when Uranus opposes Pluto in 2045. I suspect it's closer to the 2040s where we'll reach mass ubiquity, just because we're sort of beginning into a new cycle now. And everything that we're doing now is sort of planting the seeds for where things may be in another 16 years or so. So this is, when you stack up all these different transits on top of each other, you could see that there's sort of a clustering that happens in the 2045 to 20 this time period. There's a lot of cycles that are kind of like coming on top of each other. So there seems to be like there's going to be something that is going to be a similar type of new, like I'd say, culmination of where technology is at. And Saturn Neptune, you can look at this as a graph of you basically plotting Neptune's going slowly there, and Saturn's going a lot more quickly. And basically, anytime these are connecting, they're quadrature cycles. So the conjunction, first quarter square, opposition, third quarter square, and then conjunction. So basically, this is just a way of mapping out time periods. And when they're tightly conjunct, you can say that these two time periods here, 89 right now is kind of connected to 1989, 1998 to 99 is going to be connected to 2033, 2034, and the 2007 to 6 is sort of connected to 2042 to 2041 to 2042. So I just want to read briefly what Tarnas says about Saturn Neptune, just to give you like a little bit of a grounding of what he's saying around this time period. He says, a characteristic motif of Saturn Neptune eras is a heightened tension between the dialectic between ideals, hopes, and beliefs on the one hand, and the hard realities life on the other. That's the Saturn. The same complex can express itself in the form of heightened conflicts between religion and secularism, beliefs and facts, faith-based versus reality-based, and in the United States, red states versus red states versus blue states. Each side perceiving to be the other and living in a state of delusional self-deception. So we're kind of in this heightened polarization. We have the Spider-Man meme where everyone's pointing at each other saying, you're the one who's deluded. So he wrote this back in 2007, and I think it really speaks to what I'm experiencing right now in our world, but also we're in this kind of world where the rule of law is dissolving, and we have this kind of Christian nationalism that's coming up. So anyway, there's a lot of deeper themes that are happening with this kind of beginning of the new cycle right now. But it's one of those questions of like, what is truth? What's reality? What's delusion? AI is coming in and also blurring the lines of what is authentic media, what's not. We have all sorts of political deception happening. In the aftermath of all that, we sort of have this also pervasive darkening of the collective consciousness. It's like a diffuse and difficult to diagnose social malaise, at other times a direct response to deeply discouraging or tragic events. Reflecting the complex and most intense form, such eras are frequently marked by collective experiences of tragic loss, the defeat of ideals and aspirations, the death of a dream, which are accompanied by a sense of profound sorrow. For me, the dream of American democracy, is that still alive? Do we still have a functional democracy? Where do we hope? What do we still believe in humanitarian ideals? So there's a lot of ideals that are out there that there's a lot of discouraging information that puts me into this social malaise. Anyway, I want to get to this graphic, which is the very beginning of my show, where I said if you look at 1989, the beginning of the news cycle, that's when the internet ISPs were really starting to start up. You also have the Game Boy as maybe an artifact of a consumer market a product that's coming in that's kind of taking all the lessons of video games and allowing us to portabilize it. There's a further portabilization of that technology in 1988 to 89, where you have the first BlackBerry. This is kind of blending and blurring the line between when you're at work and when you're at home. And you have the kind of the first bespoke kind of enterprise use case of these cell phones that are able to allow you to communicate anywhere. And then it's kind of coming into full bloom with the iPhone. We're all addicted to our smartphones, and Neptune is like, allowing it's like this portals of escape and addiction. And we're all, it's massive. It completely went viral. Smartphones, it's like the full manifestation. It's the internet coming into full bloom. It's everything we ever wanted, but it's also like created this horrible artifacts of destroyed society in lots of different ways. It's made us all we're all standing on our screens. It's had adverse effects on democracy. So there's all these things that we're kind of reckoning with the aftermath of the impact of smartphone technology. And so at 2015, 2016, at Third Core Square, we have like all these potential antidotes that are starting to rise with every single like major AR and VR headset at the time, with the CV1 from Oculus Rift, the Vive launched. We have HoloLens, Magic Leap, all of these kind of like within a 1 degree square. We have also like the Gear VR launched there during that time period as well. So all of these things are coming up. And so now we're kind of entering into this new phase where we have the Meta display glasses, we have Android XR that's being launched, we have the second iteration of Apple Vision Pro, we have the Steam Frame, and we have the Snap AR glasses. They're kind of marking like, okay, we're at a new beginning. And a lot of the way that they're describing these technologies is like an antidote to like, hey, don't use your smartphone, use this technology that's going to potentially get you even more addicted. But also the entirety of the internet, if you look at this time period, 1989 is when internet service providers were, starting to come online in a commercial context. And so basically 1989 to 2025 represents the entirety of the internet and all the data that's on the internet, and all that data has been used to train AI. So AI is also in this kind of new nascent phase as we get into this new cycle. And you can kind of look back through some highlights, and these aren't necessarily correlated to specific, um, you know, transits to say, okay, here's the deeper story, but just roughly, Deep Blue beats Kasparov in 1996. NVIDIA launched in 1999. That was pretty significant. You have the rise of AI as computation is increasing, the ImageNet paper that was published in 2009, and then deep learning starts in 2012. And then AlphaGo beat Leads It All in 2016, which was a third core square of Saturn Neptune that, was a huge, like, AI was all in the news. I started going to AI conferences. I have a bunch of vaulted unpublished interviews that I did during that time period talking to AI researchers. And so there's a lot of ways in which that there's a correspondence between the consumer launches of XR technologies and also as AI has kind of reached these other phases that have gone viral in a commercial context. Large language models emerging 2018, 2020, and then the kind of more criticism around the stochastic parrots paper that was in 2021. So we're at the beginning of this news cycle. So we have, all these new XR technologies. We're going to be moving forward, likely reaching kind of the first quarter phase of maybe kind of the equivalent of the BlackBerry in 2033 to 2034. Maybe that's when smart glasses are going to be widely adopted in the enterprise context. And then 2041 to 2042, I suspect, is going to be a time period where we kind of hit that iPhone moment of XR. And I think, we've all been wondering, when is XR going to go mainstream? And, for me, this is like, either it's going to be like in the 2030s or 2042. I don't think now is the time that's going to viral. I think there's like seeds that are being planted right now that are going to like shape our immersive future as we go forward. And yeah, there's lots of different of these transits that I can like say as we look backwards and try to project out to see like what's the story as we look backward, and to see like how is that going to be informing the story as we move forward. And like I said, there's in the 2040s there seems to be a large spike of archetypal energies all coming together that are likely going to maybe be that iPhone moment for XR. So that's all that I have for day for that. There's a lot of new information. Thanks for your patience, and happy to take any questions and discuss anything you'd like.
Wow, that was powerful, especially when you look at perspective of the planet's life. The point about technology diffusion. So, how do you see that manifesting, specifically in art? And I just wanted to reference to your archive that contains hundreds of interviews with artists working at intersection of physical and digital. From your observations, how has the very materiality of art changed with the advent of XR? So street art, by
Hmm.
definition, exists in a specific location, and does immersive art create a similar aura of place in virtual space, or it's a fundamentally different kind of experience?
Yeah, so location-based entertainment is the area where I see a lot of momentum when it comes to, say, the sphere or cosm. We had things like the void, back before the pandemic, but then the pandemic sort of shut them down. And so, but I've continued to go to places like Sundance New Frontier when it's still around, Tribeca Immersive, South by Southwest Immersive, Tribeca Immersive, as well as going to places like IFA Doc Lab, where I get to see kind of the frontiers of documentary filmmaker, playing with the medium and pushing the medium forward. So um, the immersive storytelling hasn't been widely distributed within the larger XR ecosystem. With a lot of focus has been on games for Meta, and I'd say with like for Apple, they've actually been more focused on storytelling in terms of like 360 video and their Apple immersive video. And so they've taken an approach where they're not doing like high agency things with the medium, but they're really trying to see like how can you start to push forward the language and grammar of storytelling, and be that as a root and a base rather than gaming as the base. Um, Someone asked in the chat, I just wanted to briefly address that. So we need to wait 20 years more for XR adoption. What Lasting Zebra 920 said. Well, with the smartphones and technology, when the iPhone came out, there was already lots of people using the iPhone, but it wasn't until the iPhone came out that we started to see like billions upon billions of people using the smartphone technologies. So it really gets into that phase of adoption that gets into the late majority into mass ubiquity. So what I'm saying is that I don't expect VR to reach that phase of mass ubiquity until like around that time period, because um I don't I mean it could come early. It could be 2030s. Like, it could be other time periods. Like it like I said, it's like not concretely predictive, it's archetypally predictive. Is like there's some windows that are out there. And so the reason why I say that is just because I mean, I could be surprised. I mean, the pandemic was surprising as to what happened, and you would think that, oh, this would be, oh, that's when things would take off. But that was a like a new phase. That was like the beginning of a new phase. That wasn't like the culmination of a new phase. The iPhone moment is like the full moon. It's like coming into full bloom. And so there's a lot of things that are happening right now that are like the storytelling mechanisms, the ways that people are telling stories, the ways that they're using the technologies. There could even be like, smell and taste and other things that are starting to be prototyped on haptics, brain control interfaces, artificial intelligence. All of these things could be like coming together to kind of create a unique experiential, offering that we don't know quite how all those things will all fit together until like another 5 to 10 years, in a way that is, we already see examples of it. And that's the Simon Wardley model, is that you can start to see the genesis of an idea, the custom bespoke enterprise applications of that. And then that, when you really focus on what happens on enterprise, you focus on location based entertainment, you focus on what's happening with immersive storytelling at these festivals, you start to see a glimmer and a glimpse of where this is going. And just from all the different, ways that there's funding of $200 million that's coming from Dutch CIIIC, where they're funding these different initiatives to see how to use immersive technologies to push forward, like democracy and civic engagement. And so those won't be, the first fruits of that won't be born in for 2 or 3 more years, and maybe not until the 2030s. And so you start to see how like there's the large scale of how these platforms are playing out. And that if you would have asked me a couple of years ago, how do you think your prediction is coming out that 2025 is going to be the year that these technologies mature? And it was sort of despite all odds that, Android XR was continuing to be worked on and put out. Steam is coming out with an open source version of their headset, which, is, you know, one of the themes of Saturn Neptune is like, how much are we going to be fighting against the walled gardens that we've been living in with the big tech players versus the kind of open, the spirit of the internet when it was first come out, which was open and free and anybody could participate and it was liberating and empowering. But we've had this kind of force of authorities and control that are in power that are dictating what can and cannot exist in our digital lives by these gatekeepers. And so there's these walled gardens of like, that's one vision of the future of, are we going to continue to live in these walled gardens, or are we going to go back to the early days of the internet and have more interoperable and open source and kind of a level of freedom with our digital lives that goes above and beyond these big tech companies? So these are other themes that are, I think, emerging in this moment. And so there's this battle between like, what is the most exalted potential for these technologies, and is it going to be shepherded to us through these big tech companies, or are we going to take the power and control in our own hands and start to kind of liberate ourselves through these frameworks and open source and interoperability? These more, the EU is trying to come up with those principles of like humanitarian uh, principles and human rights law, and that's one approach. And the other approach is kind of laissez-faire capitalism, where it's just the biggest tech companies are taking control, and whatever they want to do is what our future is going to be. And so you really see this battle between the EU approach of what they want to see the future of technology and the more kind of Western American approach, which is just let the companies do whatever they want and let the big tech decide. And so there's this other battle that I think is also playing out in terms of these closed wall gardens versus this open interoperable, that I think also kind of speaks to this moment of this new cycle starting. And it's great to see Valve in there with that Steam frame, because that kind of represents that open source vision. When that comes into full bloom, what's that going to look like? When AR glasses are in full bloom, what's that's going to look like? We've all been wanting this to happen like yesterday, but I think if we have at least a time frame of 10 to 20 years, it gives us some perspective to see like the seeds are being planted now. This is not a time for things to be going viral and going into full bloom. This is not the iPhone moment right now. This is the planting seeds to be able to grow an ecosystem in a sustainable, organic way, not one that's like falsely supported by VC funding and driven by hype that may be overblown.
Yeah, talking about 360 cameras, I really like Ryan Hartel's works, and I think he's consciously working with this dynamic, this new modern stuff, and that's a really good example of how to adopt it. So we have a few questions in the chat actually. So we need to wait 20 years more for XR adoption, Lestin Zebra asks.
Yeah, I sort of addressed that in the previous comment, saying that adoption is going to continue. It's just not going to go super viral, I don't think. I think what we're looking at is still this enterprise phase where, rather than thinking about the consumer market, thinking around how are we going to build sustainable businesses on the enterprise space and really have a sustainable ecosystem. I think there's been this rush for Meta to want to have this push towards everything going mainstream. And by doing that, they've undercut the ecosystem, they've subsidized the headsets, they've kind of done all these anti-competitive behaviors so that it's hard to compete at the same price point. And then they've eliminated a lot of the competition in that way, but it's also meant that the larger ecosystem isn't really sustainable for a lot of medium independent like developers. But there's still a lot of sustainable businesses for use cases, for enterprise use cases for XR. And I think that with this new crop of headsets, they are available for the consumer, but I see them more as like enterprise use cases for like the utility of those being proven out across all these other more enterprise. So going to AWE and seeing how they're being used by different companies and training contexts, and that there's a real return on their investment, and that there's a lot of really compelling use cases for it. But and the consumer space will still be there, but I don't expect it to really like take off like like the iPhones did until later, just because I do think that in the large scale of a 500-year period, computing technologies are the printing press of our era. which means that there will be artificial intelligence, experiential technologies with XR, MR, AR, all these R's being melded together in different contexts, and that these computing technologies are the way that we're making sense of our world, and that will be the kind of predominant media for probably another 300, 400 years, especially as AI gets further developed and have more sophisticated cognitive models and beyond just like simplistic large language models. We're at a very nascent stage of even AI. And so to think around like artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence, these are speculative ideas, but you kind of get the sense of like them coming into full bloom is that they're not like hallucinating and just making up shit. They're actually having models of the world, and they have experience, and that they're embodied. They have some sort of ways that they're learning from the world. So we're not at that point where AI is at right now. So I feel like even where AI is at, it's a very nascent sort of baby technology. Even though it's very powerful in certain use cases and contexts, it falls on its face in other ways. And so it's very narrow for the different bands of utility that you get from AI right now. But as we move forward, it's like AI is where AI is now is sort of where the internet was in 1989. Very nascent, very undeveloped, not widely uh, distributed or used in many different contexts. And so, as the more sophisticated models of AI come in, rather than just throwing GPU and compute at it and call it a day, there's going to be more innovation that needs to happen on deeper, more sophisticated cognitive models to kind of understand intelligence in a more nuanced, sophisticated way. So it's not just taking an average of the most likely next word, but actually having a deeper understanding. So, given all that, I think it's going to take a while for everything to really kind of flow together. And so, I'm just sort of in this talk advocating for us to have a little bit of patience and to like really focus on how to organically continue to grow the XR industry from the enterprise space without trying to imagine like the iPhone moment of XR, which may not come for another 20 years.
Yeah, that's a critical observation, especially for them who work with all these new realities. So, Jimmy wrote in the chat, I like the slide about the tribal storytelling and how we might be headed towards that again with AI, like world labs and vision language action models. How do you see that working out now and in the longer run?
Yeah, that slide was from Alex McDowell and him talking about this kind of this practice of world building and how, the early days of storytelling where the stories weren't fixed. They were dynamic, they were responsive. People would play music in the audience. They would change and adapt the story to kind of fit to whatever is happening in the moment. And so you have this kind of live, what we call now living storytelling. I think it was, back then the process of oral storytelling was that practice of matching the moment with the story. And there's that interplay, and from more of an indigenous perspective, is what makes that practice of knowledge keeping so vital. Is because you were telling and keeping the knowledge in the stories, but you were responding to the moment. And whenever you fix it in a book, then that becomes a canonical version, and then you refer to that as like the only version. But we're kind of moving back into an era where we're trying to give us more agency and participation, interactivity into how the stories are both told and lived and experienced. Um, and there's different storytelling structures in terms of how much narrative agency do you have based upon, you make this decision, how does that change the story that you receive? That's a fairly sophisticated thing, and can't really be managed by, let's say, immersive theater, where you're making sophisticated nuanced decisions and then you get tailored stories. That's a little bit, beyond the scope of what humans can process and do in real time, although I'm sure it's been done, and there's lots of great experiments for what's possible in the kind of immersive theater realm. But when you start to look at more sophisticated cognitive or like models, when I would go to there was a kind of artistic expressions of AI. I think it was called AID, AI for design entertainment, AI IDE, something like that. I went to a conference there and came across some people that were using like more sophisticated ways of, tracking how if this action happens and that changes the overall state, and then that will um, uh, change the way that you're able to kind of live in the world. I think it was called Elsinore was the experience that I did. which was you trying to go through, I think it was Hamlet, and you're trying to basically like every action you make, you're basically trying to change the outcome of the story. Um, and but they needed a sophisticated kind of AI world model to be able to do that. So I do think that this kind of Westworld model where you're tracking the nuances of your actions that are being fed back into all those, you know, the story that you're receiving. I think ultimately what we want is like transformative stories. Like stories are going to be finely tuned to us, and we're going to get the exact type of archetypal experiences that we want or that we need from moment to moment. And so I do think that they're overall the stories, if they are responsive, dynamic, can be highly tuned to just you. There's a immersive theater group called Odyssey Works that would basically spend a month researching you and talking to your friends and family and relatives, and they were trying to really understand you and what you needed, and they would create like a whole ritual and a story just for you to have a transformative experience. And I feel like that's a lot of time and energy for you to spend a month like tracing all the data. And so there's a future where the data that are collected and used by these immersive technologies are used in that kind of transformative context. But what I fear is that we're kind of moving into a world where all that data information is used to basically, violate our privacy, where it's going to be tracking us and it's going to be empowering these companies to, have these world models of our psychographical information, and that they're going to be using that to try to sell us stuff rather than empower us for our own personal use or transformative use cases. So I do think that we're in this realm where privacy, as we move forward, is going to be a huge issue, especially when it comes to what happens to that data, who has access to it, what kind of insights are they garnering from it. So yeah, there's a lot of like potentials for how AI is going to feed into these different types of ways that we're receiving the stories and what that is able to give to us. But I'd refer to Nita Farahani and her work on cognitive liberty, and her book called The Battle for the Brain, which is kind of detailing how neurotech is a part of this new cycle as we move forward. That there's going to be more and more sophisticated ways of measuring what's happening in our biometric like data that we're radiating out, and as that data are being radiated out, how is that being used to kind of underline our cognitive liberties. So that's something to look out for. That on the one hand, it can be very empowering if we have access to that and we're in control over it. But if we don't, then who has control over that, and how are they using it to potentially undermine our cognitive liberties?
That exact tension between AI and all the other world, I would say, is so compelling to me as a curator. And I just wanted to continue this topic a little about AI. So it is both a creation tool and a potential source of the dead internet theory. And in your archive, do you see artists using AI not as a crutch, but as a author or as material for critical reflection on creativity, originality, and authorship in the digital age?
Yeah, so there's this big tension between, the degree to which that AI is unlocking this creative power and how much is it creating a sort of monoculture, meaning that it's synthesizing everything, but really not having much diversity in that. It's losing the perspectives and the context. It's a context collapse. So I said that, in my talk that AI is kind of connected to the Saturn Pluto complex because it was created in the response to the Cold War. So it has a lot of geopolitical implications for how AI is developed, how it has been funded over the years, and how it's now being contextualized of we need to fund all these AI companies so we can fight China and not lose the war of this AI supremacy kind of next frontier. So it has a very kind of geopolitical and war context. So that's worth noting that AI as a technology consolidates wealth and consolidates power. So whose wealth is being consolidated, whose power is being consolidated. Um, all the billionaires that are out there now, these tech companies, they see it as an existential thing they have to invest all this money. So because of that, we're in this moment where we don't know whether or not there's going to be real returns on those investment, in the sense that is it going to actually be profitable to have some of these? Because right now it's basically a big money pit where it costs a lot of money to do it. It costs a lot of money to basically provide these models, but they seem to be useful enough for people to be using. But yet at the same time, they're not really using consent, or you don't have permission to get access to all this data. So they're kind of stealing all this data. Karen Howe has a book called The Empire of AI, where she really details how there's kind of an imperial colonial impulse with AI right now, where there's a seizing of the data, and they're trying to kind of like in the process of seizing that data, extract the value out of it and redistribute that. And so we might be in this like sense of collective delusion, the Saturn Neptune around, where we're in this bubble where there isn't any short term or medium term return on that. So all this money that's being invested in infrastructure could collapse at some point because it's not profitable. Um, at the end of the day, the more that people use it, the more it costs, and the more, either if you're giving it away for free, these companies are having to play this game of chicken where how long can they survive on this investment in VC funding before they actually need to like get real and turn a profit. So this is a, a perfect sort of Saturn Neptune moment where how real is this, or how kind of in a sense of diluted reality are we? There's a book by Emily Embender and Alex Hanna called The AI Con, which is basically trying to pop that AI hype bubble and try to ground us back into reality. I do think at some point there will need to be a level set, but it seems like every major company is investing in it equally so that everybody's in the same type of arms race of trying to provide these utilities with AI, that it's difficult to know at what point the bubble will pop, or if it ever will pop, or if this is a part of our new reality that as we move forward. I suspect that may be a part of it as well, that everyone's sort of collectively agreed that this is where we're going. I do expect that AI is going to have utility at some point, but I think the large language models are like far insufficient into doing all the different things that you need. And there's this whole issue of consent, of just kind of stealing the data, extracting value. And so there's a lot of ways that this current model is displacing labor. There's Kirby Ferguson. He's got the everything's a remix kind of argument where um, these AIs could represent, you just remixing data. But I think it's at a scale that's different than just say artists and humans. And there's a tendency to try to collapse the complexity of human creativity into the kind of mechanical nature of what computer algorithms are doing. And I think that humans are a lot more nuanced and complex than that. And so I'm hesitant to sort of do comparisons to say AI is just like human creativity. I think there's different processes that are happening. But I also think there's a kind of a dehumanizing aspect when we, right now with AI, that is in this place that is stealing data and displacing data and creating a lot of AI slop, which honestly, when I look at the art, is not as inspiring as what is being created by people that are handcrafted. Surely there are exemplars of
Yeah.
people that are pushing the edge, but there's also just a lot of crap that's out there, and a kind of lowest common denominator, just throwing AI as a stopgap for not really having anything to say, and letting the AI say it. I've seen a number of different projects on the immersive circuit that sort of end up like that, and it feels like I'm just chatting with any other kind of large language model or chat GPT. This isn't really giving me a narrative experience that is differentiated from what I might be getting directly from OpenAI, Anthropic, or anything else. So I think the other dimension, just to mention, is that there's an open source dimension. And so to what degree are these weights open and available and for people to run on their own machines versus relying upon these big companies to run it for you? Because I do think that, like I said, AI is a technology that is consolidating wealth and power. And so it's important to keep that in mind, like whose wealth and power is being consolidated, because you may be sort of dependent upon these big systems and paying a monthly subscription forever that continues to go up without any recourse of, paying attention to what value you're getting out of that. So having an open source vector on there, I think, is also important as a balancing, but also to see that, to maintain some sort of sovereignty and control, and be able to train your own models and to tune it in a way that isn't just replicating all the biases that are in these large language models.
I was referring to your slide about life that must be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. And
Yeah.
I think it's perfectly articulated the modern curator's dilemma. So you are an oral historian, and the curator is essentially also a historian working with narratives in here and now. And in your view, how should the role of a curator change in an era where art becomes immersive, that worked and exists in decentralized form? What new skills critical?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's I think that artists naturally tune into the archetypal dynamics of the moment. In my talk at United XR, I go into a lot more detail for Doc Lab and how Doc Lab's theme was off the internet and how there was a lot of artists that were reflecting and contemplating the impact of algorithms and technology and the internet on our lives. And so artists are naturally attuned to what's happening in the world, and then through their own creative imagination, they're tuning into these deeper stories of the moment. And so a good artist will be able to tap into the collective energies of a moment and turn it into a piece of art that allows people to kind of collapse it down into their own personal experience, but to be able to be connected to this deeper trends of what's happening in the moment. And so I feel like a big thing of the off the internet was reflecting on the internet, but also trying to have a moment of creative imagination to imagine where do we want to take our creative like online existence and lives as we move forward. And so a lot of artists are thinking around that. And so the role of a curator is to basically do a collection of those artists and to come up with those deeper archetypal themes and to present them to an audience and to try to have some deeper context for how each individual art is speaking to the moment. And so that's what I go to these different I love talking to artists and immersive storytellers because it's the artists who are really attuned to what's happening at a deeper level. And so by talking to them, I get a sense of not only what's happening right now, but also it is this moment of capturing the moment of the history that allows me to look back, but also to project forward. So yeah, that Kierkegaard quote of, life can only be understood looking backwards. And so it's not until the end of your life that you perhaps fully understand the full context for everything that happens to you. But by that point, it's too late. And the dilemma is that you have to live your life forwards. And so, okay, well, how do you extrapolate and make inductive leaps of logic based upon what you've seen in the past? How do you project that out into the future? And that's a little bit of what I'm presenting here is a bit of a methodology of trying to, at least identify those deeper archetypal themes that have happened in the past to see what the weather is moving forward and to see, how we can start to kind of tell the story of what has been happening in our digital lives as we look backwards, but also project forwards with our creative imagination because the future is not determined. We are co-creating it all together. And so everybody listening has the opportunity to participate in this unfolding of what the story is actually going to be. And so that's a lot of what the arts and artists and curators are doing is that they are creating these samples of allowing you to tap into these deeper themes and threads of the moment and allowing you to connect as a human into that moment and to kind of make sense of the moment because the artists are digesting it and allowing us to feel it. And my latest episode with Andrew M. Davis, he's really talking about Whitehead in this process philosophy where at the end of the day we're sort of synthesizing all of our anticipating the future, integrating the past to all our sensory experiences and taking our actions, and it's all being synthesized into our emotions and our feelings. And it's those feelings that we're able to kind of have these peak emotional experiences that allow us to mark a moment and remember and create our memory and create our own story. And so we're kind of architecting our peak emotional memories of our lives to kind of construct the story of our lives. And that's what artists are doing at a collective level. So, and curators are a huge part of being able to curate those voices and to be able to present them in a way that general audiences can have access to that.
Yeah, spot on. And I think that's a perfect segue to talk about communities and metaverses and digital public sphere. In your slide about circles of virtual reality, you mentioned this, and I just wanted to ask. So platforms like Spatial, where we are now, claim to be new public spaces. As a gallery worker, I think about building community. In your opinion, what principles should form the foundation of a genuine digital public sphere for art so it doesn't turn into just another commercialized digital shopping mall?
Well, in order to be a truly public sphere, it would need to be owned by the public, owned by the governments, meaning it'd be government owned. This is still a commercial entity. And so, I love what's happening right now in these online spaces, but they're still private companies. At the end of the day, they're creating the experience of a sphere that feels public, but it's actually still private. A public sphere, I think, would need to ultimately be owned by the public, owned by the government. We don't necessarily see a lot of examples of that, but I think at the CIIIC, there's a lot of discussion around what's it mean to kind of reclaim different aspects of the public domain as these kind of algorithms in these online spaces have kind of infiltrated our lives. Then the public spaces are increasingly owned by private companies, and not excluding spatial, unless you have a purely kind of open source kind of model like what Mozilla Hubs had. Uh, but even then, at some point, there has to be somebody who is, hosting it and owning it. And at the end of the day, it's normally been like a nonprofit or a single person, or still like a private. But that all said, that could be a technicality. But I think it's also important just to recognize that how much of our digital lives are ruled by these companies and their code of conduct, and that the public spaces is something that is increasingly decreasing over time. This is something that the future of the internet and architects of Space Popular, Berta Kellberg and Laura Lesmeds, they were talking about at a gathering at the Architectural Association, where they were talking about the future of the immersive internet, and the question around these public spaces and access that we have to them. And I think, in this time where we have increasing amounts of authoritarianism around the world, having spaces to be able to speak in a way that is authentic and private. All the, I think we still have a long way to go in terms of like really creating anonymous peer-to-peer ways that you can authentically communicate in a way that you isn't encrypted and feels like you are. We have things like Signal and WhatsApp and other sort of end-to-end encryption techniques of speaking via text, but we don't see as many of those spaces in the digital sphere. So that's probably another area that's ripe for innovation, where tr- coming up with truly private spaces there where people can connect. But even when you are connected, you never know if someone is recording, or I don't know if there's any way to like hard prevent things from being documented. So those are some of the different things I think about when I think about these public spaces. There's still a lot of value in meeting face to face, because anytime that you're meeting online, there's still that risk that it could be compromised, that it could be recorded, that it could get into wrong hands. And so there's still this kind of unease around what someone may share and feel comfortable sharing in one of these spaces versus what they may share face to face. But you get a certain anonymity here on virtual spaces, and maybe avatar expression that allows you to tune into different expressions of your identity. I see what's happening with the trans community online and VR chat as a great exemplar of ways that people can find and express their identity in a private way that allows them to find parts of themselves that they can't really express in other contexts. And I think that's also a key part of finding parts of your identity that may be uniquely expressed on these virtual platforms. So yeah, I've been to the decentralized web conference a couple of times, and I think my time there is becoming more and more pertinent, because the threats of authoritarian governments were kind of more theoretical and afar, but now they seem to be coming closer and closer to home in a way that some of those kind of decentralized web technologies may be increasingly important as we move forward, and thinking about how do we safely connect and gather and assemble online in these virtual spaces.
You've just pinpointed the core of communities in metaverse, I guess. So,
Nice.
in a chat we have Viper. Your comment about looking forward and backward into the time reminds me of the white queen in Alice through the Looking Glass book. She remembers things before happen. Yeah.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, there's this word that Alfred North Whitehead uses called prehension, which is different than apprehension or comprehension. The prehension is sort of the felt feeling that allows you to assemble the combination of the past and the present and the kind of the future, anticipating the future in the mental pole, as Whitehead would say, and you're inheriting the past of the physical pole, and all of that sort of being synthesized and fused through emotions. But there is a way that the feelings kind of like span both the past and present in Whitehead's model, which you kind of get into these precognitive hits as a mode and method for how you could either have precognitive hits, or even ways that you are sort of having mathematical intuition, where you're able to kind of discern and perceive into non-spatial temporal realms of mathematical objects that allow you to kind of understand the kind of boundaries and the shapes and forms that are in this kind of theoretical platonic realm of ideal forms, and this kind of intuition or prehensive feeling or creative imagination are all ways that we use to express how we're kind of tapping into these transcendent realms. So yeah, it's great to hear that that's kind of reflected into the Looking Glass book.
Final question about hope and the future of metaverse. So, after more than 1,800 interviews, what one or two specific projects or names from the world of immersive art in the past year give you the most hope that this new technological cycle will bring not just hardware, but qualitative leap in cultural expression and human experience? And what must we all absolutely see?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that there's some really powerful immersive stories that I had a chance to see at Doc Lab that gives me hope that using the whatever combination of different immersive tech together, specifically, I'm thinking of um, Khalif Ben or Karim Ben Khalifa's piece called "In 36,000 Ways" that allow that basically is a theatrical piece where you step into a sculpture that has over 100 bits of hanging shrapnel, and you hold in your hand this piece of shrapnel, and as you pick it up off this pillow and put on these headphones, all the lights turn down and it's a spotlight that's put on you, and you immediately hear your heartbeat because there's a thermal camera that's looking at your face, and you feel this haptic experience of your heartbeat with this butt kicker underneath your feet. So you have this visceral experience of your own heartbeat as you're holding this piece of shrapnel. And he's telling the story of how in modern warfare, when a missile strikes, there could be 36,000 pieces of shrapnel that are shot out up to 500 meters, and they're lethal. And if you get hit, you could get killed by these. And so it's in the installation, you're holding this piece of shrapnel. You feel the weight, you feel the sharpness, and you feel like you're in the middle of the explosion. And it just was deeply powerful because it took the kind of abstractions of war that we see through social media, our feed, this kind of social malaise that is very dissociative to have context collapse on social media these days, where it's just war maxed up with comedy and influencers, and there's fascism and tech fascism and propaganda and lies. It's just this the world feels like it's falling apart, and you watch your social media feed, and it could just be this doom scrolling of disaster that you're just feeding into your psyche without really processing it, the deeper context and feeling. And then for Karim being Ben Khalifa, he's wanting to restore this sense of feeling and emotion, and that you can't just like experience these things without processing it in a more feeling level. And when it's stripped of context and history, it's hard to do that. And so by seeing that experience and to hear him read this beautiful poetic description of this kind of state of the social malaise that we're in right now, just really cracked my heart open and gave me this sense of like being connected to my humanity and to feel it and process it. And so that's a piece that I look to say like, okay, this is guidance for us as we move forward. We're in this time of like real authoritarian impulses around the world of leaders who are incentivized to use AI to deceive us and to lie to us and to just construct a reality that we all know is not true, but enough people know it's true that it convinces them. It's so alluring, and so we live in this like crossroads of descent into fascism and authoritarianism where it could be extremely hopeless. And I find hope in the storytellers and our power of creative imagination to imagine a better future, and to know that these are short term things that are happening. They're not going to last forever. They're going to last long enough to serve the ends of whatever the people in power are wanting to do with that. But there's a deeper thread of our creative imagination and power to tell stories that tells a different story and allows us to imagine a new future. And so, are we going to live into a future of walled gardens, or are we going to live in a future that has interoperable, open, based upon humanitarian principles and about access and privacy and dignity? All these things that are coming from the European Union that they have a variety of different projects. when I look at this moment, I look at this kind of like crossroads of like, what path are we going to go down as we think about the future of our technology? We're at the beginning of a new cycle. The future is undetermined. We can determine which way we go. The choices and consumer choices you make right now can help dictate and be a vote as to what kind of future you want to live into. That open source interoperable future is a lot of extra work. It's not quite fully baked, but it's one that gets me really super excited. And just so to think about like the Steam frame as a kind of uh, an archetypal representation of that, ways for us to kind of untether ourselves from the power of these, not that Steam is an entity within its own right, but these other big tech companies that are controlling so much of our lives and society. So that gives me hope that we can have a future that we can use our creative imagination to live into a future that we actually want, rather than one that's dictated to us. Um, that we've lived in this world for since 2007, since the iPhone, that coming into full bloom, and it may be until 2033 or 2042 until we fully untether ourselves from the kind of tangled web of the influence. But I feel hopeful that this is an opportunity for us to kind of help chart where we go in the future. And everybody here in this room has an opportunity to kind of play into that. And I think that's what's extremely exciting. So thanks so much, Elsa, for inviting me to kind of share some thoughts and to pontificate on this and to kind of reflect on where we're at now or where we may be headed here in the future.
Thank you. Well, the future is a haze, but your words feel like a steady hand, and it gives a quite sense of clarity. And just like that, in a conversation about circles, we complete our own circle, the final Inloco MetaTalks of 2025. And Kent, our deepest gratitude, your gift for seeing not just the technology, but the narratives that shape it is precisely the compass we all need on the brink of a new immersive age. And to you, our special community, a special thank you for building this digital campfire we gather around. Your questions, your presence, this is the very living fabric from which the future of metaverses or immersive experiences woven. We are stepping away now, not just from a calendar year, we are closing a chapter so that in the next one we can begin writing anew. And if today's conversation tells us anything, it is that the next wave is not just about new hardware, it's about new meaning. It's about how artists will challenge algorithms and how communities will build worlds on top of platforms. Let's think of this not as a goodbye, but as a point of assembly, a place from which we push off to meet again in 2026 with new ideas and absolutely with new art that doesn't yet exist. And wishing you a peaceful winter, deep reflections, and bold experiments. We'll see you in your circle in 2026. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a few more minutes. I have, I'm available if anyone wants to ask questions or
Yep.
chat afterwards as well.
Yes, I do. I do have question. Can't imagine like a 10 years or 5 years ahead, and if you'll be a director or creative producer, I don't know, which immersive experience you would like to launch with all the technology that already
Hmm.
exists and with all the technology that will be developed soon, as you see. So yeah, tell us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's I got into virtual reality originally to be able to do like different types of visualizations of these types of astrological archetypal dynamics. And so I feel like there's a lot of really interesting and like the kind of provocation is can you go into an immersive experience and be able to visualize something about the core dynamics of your life so that it'd be like walking into a waking dream so that as you come out you feel like you have new insights or information that allows you to become more of yourself, to become more present to the moment and more present to the larger stories of your own life as they're unfolding, and to be able to visualize time in a way that allows you to connect yourself to your own cycles of your own life as they unfold. Because our lives are these many different cycles unfolding at different paces. And so are there ways to basically map that out in a way that allows you to get more in touch with that, to become more empowered into your own life as it unfolds? So that's the kind of things that I'm really interested in, like playing with, experimenting with. How can you take your archive of photos that you have on your phone, and that is basically a proto photo diary that marks moments of your life, and can that be architected in a way that allows you to see some of the deeper patterns and themes of your life as it unfolds? So that's the type of things that I'm thinking a lot about. That's the things that I want to make an experience myself, which is to go into an experience and come out of it more deeply connected to my own life, almost like I'm entering into a dream world that is able to be kind of displayed and just shown to me in a way that gets me even deeper connected to, you know, like who I'm supposed to be in the world.
Cool. Sounds like super cool project. I would love to see it and build it, and just, yeah, I think it's coming. Thank you for sharing. It's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.